So now for a completely different scale. Green City Kigali is a one-off, truly exciting, but extremely challenging project. When I say it's a one-off, we've seen plenty of green cities over the last 2 or 3 days, but what you haven't seen is how those have been combined with extreme issues of affordability and delivering these on the ground in some of the poorest countries in the world. The sort of aim of this project is to address a whole series of multi-layered concerns about development in Africa, but to develop ultimately a product that could be replicable elsewhere, both in Rwanda, but also in East Africa. So let's just remind ourselves of what the true global need is at the moment. We've seen various schemes addressing building in different climates, but this is absolutely the hub of it for the next few years up until 2050. We've reached 8 billion people globally. We're going to reach 9.7 billion by the time we get to 2050, and more than half of that will be in Africa and the global south. What that means is almost 1 billion people joining those cities where there's limited infrastructure and limited building, new buildings to support that over the next 25 to 26 years. Just a quick reminder of where Rwanda is. So it's equatorial, very similar level to Singapore, but 1,500 meters up. So it enjoys the most beautiful climate of diurnal temperatures around 20 degrees average. It's a country called Les Mille Collines, 1,000 hills. It has very challenging slopes to build on, prized plateaus on the top, and preserved wetlands at the bottom. And this network of hills and valleys runs across the whole country. Kigali itself occupies 11 of those hills, and we are being given one of those to develop as Green City Kigali. So when you take that sort of global issue and you look at it locally, the population in Rwanda, which is one of the densest in Africa at the moment, is going to double by 2050, and that will be around the urban centers. And these are with a sort of first generation of urban settlers as well. Rwanda contributes 0.003% of global greenhouse gas emissions, yet is suffering some of the worst effects of it with a lengthening dry season and increasing frequency of extreme weather events. It's a landlocked country. It has very limited production for materials itself. This is its sort of prized piece in the middle of the city, which disproportionately cost a huge amount of money importing from overseas. So we can't build like this. And it's a very specific culture. We all know the history of Rwanda, hopefully. It's come through that and sustained a stability and a cohesion at the moment through its incredible sort of community action and community sort of sense of community. This is Umuganda, where they come out once a month to maintain public spaces, raise money, help repair the most underprivileged people within society, their houses. And this is the Prime Minister, Paul Kagame, contributing to that. So the project has 4 themes: affordable and socially equitable development, global warming, adaptation and mitigation, resource efficiency, and then the last piece, which I'll come on to at the very end, is this issue of culturally sensitive urban design. And then layered over those, as we've been building this up, as we've been working on this for the last 3 years, so all these sub-issues that are very particular to Rwanda. And they include, for instance, how do you walk and navigate these hills? How do you create streets that are 1 in 12 through cost-cutting streets? And they all have mutual sort of benefits in that creating these walking streets reduces the number of cars, it reduces the number of motorbikes, improves health. And so each of these is sort of acting with each other. I'll pick through some of these as we go through. So we have 2 commissions that have been running in parallel, one of which is to master plan 600 hectares and 170,000 people across the hill, and the other is a pilot project to deliver part of that over 16 hectares. Kinyinya Hill is a mixture of agricultural land, informal settlements, formal infrastructure, and very informal infrastructure as well. So it's dumping sewage into the wetlands, for instance, at the moment in parts. So we call this a sort of bottom-up approach to rapid urbanism. So this is thinking what assets the hill has to offer that we can build on and create a new community around. So the first one is movement migrations, how we can thread a new BRT corridor through a hill with multiple land occupancies, how we can create a new bus route. And then how we create sub-centres and different communities across the hill activated by transit nodes associated with efficient bus systems. How we can improve the spiritual and social life, finding the churches that can bring together these sub-communities. How we can create the community centres where Umaganda can be ran from. And here's an example of one of those where there may be some trade, where there's space for women, there's training, and again, these sort of Umaganda kind of centres where they can run their community welfare. Employment and enterprise. We're trying to keep as many people on the hill, and so it's first of all providing space for employment. So out of 170,000 people, we're providing around 60,000 places for jobs on the hill, which is around looking at agroforestry, it's around brick making, it's around agriculture itself, but it's also around providing the enterprise spaces and the growth spaces spread across all of the communities. So there's an example there of, it's a street-based sort of master plan system where we're creating lots of small units that can be bought up, could be let out as apartments, could be warehouses, could be shops, etc., small businesses. Learning and exploring, fundamental that we get the right number of schools to serve that population in the right places, but also the nurseries, the secondaries, the TVETs, opportunities for universities to come in and research the Green City, but also the city being a didactic tool itself, learning how bioswales work, for instance, so the community can maintain them. And so the schools form an important function of bringing sub-communities together. Health and well-being is probably the last one, and again, that's making sure we've got the right community infrastructure, the right amount of health clinics, hospitals, but also making it a healthy place to live. You know, this whole sort of walking city and 15-minute city connected to nature and landscape. And making sure that we can easily navigate what are 1 in 6 to 1 in 8 slopes on that hill, and making sure that we can push bikes up down the side of stairs, etc., and making these a sort of lattice of 1 in 12 streets that run across the hill. So we have a few structural issues, well, one of which, so the sort of top-down bits in a way, are creating this network of green spaces that run across the hill. These serve a number of purposes, from play spaces, peri-urban agricultural spaces, but also to manage the water on the hill and filter the water before it gets to wetlands with a whole series of nature-based detention basins at the bases. At the middle is a walled-off site that's been kept sacrosanct for 30 years. This has been converted into a park, sort of biopark, with the potential for ecotourism to support the hill, and it is a destination for tourism potentially. The BRT is not just a bus route, it is a linear park that brings all of the hill together. Blue-green social networks, these are key. So these are the tracks that separate the sub-communities, create the play spaces, and this sort of peri-urban intense agricultural spaces. So at the moment we're going out to consultation with the city on this complete master plan for adoption. So as part of that, we're doing a 16-hectare pilot project. Now this is taking one of those segments with all of its designed infrastructure, all of its housing, schools, commercial space. We've been designing this in parallel, and it's been informing back to the 600, which has been absolutely vital in terms of the affordability issues. Placemaking, we're working with extremely interesting local consultants who have been doing lots of work on the typologies of multifamily dwellings, the courtyards, going through to how streets work with colonnades, protecting you from the heat, well, the radiation from the midday, but also the rain. And that's been interpreted back into over 60 typologies to address the affordability issue. So there's different houses for different economic groups. And this is a very small incremental housing type set around narrow lanes and a courtyard type development with auxiliary dwelling units at the back. And these can be built up over time as money becomes available. But these then are set around lanes that open up into Imbuga, shared courtyard spaces. All of the incremental houses have a street frontage on them. I'll rattle through the last few. Again, these build up, framing those spaces through time. Natural ventilation everywhere, natural daylighting, natural materials. We're using coffee husk fired bricks, organic materials where possible. And then there's just a few views here looking through the 16 hectares, a working courtyard of some of the lowest income housing. Some expensive housing to cross-subsidize the infrastructure to go into the low-income neighborhoods, and then back to the sort of center and the street and the life of this place. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the presentation. I've got a question about, are you working with local, you said local people, local consultants.
Yeah.
Are they architects working locally with you?
Exactly.
And this connects to the question about when planning for such a large portion of land like this, are you working with, are you designing every single building, or are you working with different architects designing different buildings?
Yeah, interesting question. FBW are local architects, but they're also a multidisciplinary team, so they provide engineering. We're working with a guy called Peter Rich, who's a South African-based architect. He used to sit on the board in Kigali, so he's also contributed to the placemaking. But they're designing some buildings. A Studio Space are designing some. We're designing some. FBW are. And then Studio FH, a guy called Felix Holland, is also designing some of the school buildings.
Who's the actual client for this project?
So FNEWA is the Green Fund of Rwanda. So it's a sort of delivery arm for things like eco parks. It's a special purpose vehicle called the Green City Kigali Company. The money for the sort of upfront investment into the design and consultancy fees is provided by the German government.
And is there meant to be a return on that?
No. So developing out the 16 hectares, there is a return, but that return is ring-fenced by the infrastructure for the phase 2 development. So what we can't do is design a scheme that's reliant on funding, basically, or aid. It has to be self-running. So yeah, that's really important. And that's been perhaps one of the biggest challenges, is that the next phase cannot be reliant on any international funding.
You presented a project that has incredible depth of scale, from the grand to very small individual houses, and that's really extraordinary. But I got a little the sense of an inevitability of the plan as opposed to what it's really trying to do. I know what it's trying to do for people, but as a plan, where is it coming from? What were the challenges? What was the design stages that led to it? I don't have a good sense of that.
So, I mean, we've obviously been through a very lengthy community consultation process on this that started within the communities on the Hill itself. We've also consulted all the government departments, and then there's been a sort of evolution of the design with the clients and the community. I think what we have to sort of be mindful of is this is a sort of 25-year master plan. It is going to change. We put a line in the sand on day one. I mean, it is unbelievable in the 2 years that we've started. The economics of it have changed already. So we've had to change the design to make it affordable. That's going to change in the next lot. There's going to be other architects coming forward. But I think the network of walkable streets and the BRT and the sort of structural spine and the preservation of the green space on the Hill is fundamental. We've seen master plans similar to this in Kampala, for instance, where they've just built over the green land eventually. And so I think it's unique in that there is a government intention to absolutely preserve the structural parts of the master plan. But some of it's going to be architecture without architects, hopefully.
Thank you.
Is it envisaged that the people who will live here are already the residents of Kigali?
There will be some residents who live on the hill. There will be some from Kigali, but it's also, for population and migration growth.
Right.
Yeah.
You had to raise to a little bit the materials. I was quite interested on the materials and how it's going to get built. Who's going to build it? How's it going to get built?
Okay, so concrete is massively expensive. So we're trying to reduce the number of buildings at over 2 to 3 stories. The system that we're proposing is a roll-lock bond scat system brick. So it's thin bricks, diaphragm wall construction that you can build to 3 stories without any concrete. You can sometimes put concrete in the corners if you need to. So that's what you see on the bottom left, and that's fired with a byproduct of the agricultural industry. The wetlands are full of incredible clay. The already environmental impact assessment is done on that for that extraction, and the supply chain's already started to be established. We've planted something like 3,000 trees already on the hill in anticipation of this.
I do have a question about maybe the relationship between Rwanda's culture and the urban scheme. I mean, for living in an African city, many times we see that whatever is planned by government or by urban authorities is usually clashing with local culture. Is it something that you've experienced and maybe through the process have tried to solve? And also another question about density. I mean, you mentioned that Kigali is a quite dense place. How do you intend to sort of deal with this challenge?
Okay, so I mean, there's some fundamental things about the culture there. The city of Kigali master plan shows images of people eating on streets. That just doesn't happen. People eat in the privacy of roof terraces or behind secluded walls. So that's the sort of, the first one. It's not a cafe culture. It's not some sort of European model. So it's understanding that to begin with. We've market tested all of the house typologies, and it's very evident that, it's about land ownership for people. They want a plot of land. So this low scale, high intensity, deep plot, narrow frontage, efficient units, something they're very interested in. And that whole thing of multifamily dwellings and compounds, this has all sort of been evolved through these consultations as well. And to have, relatives come and live in a small room at the back of the courtyard, for instance. So I think, there's been a huge amount of work embedded in making this work. It will have density within it. I mean, it's, depending on the numbers of people that live there, of course, but the dwellings per hectare is not really a sort of factor that we're considering because it slews it, really.
Thank you very much.
Okay.